The winter of 2023 was one of the coldest Connecticut had seen in years. Snow covered everything like a thick white blanket, and the wind cut through anyone who dared to step outside. But on that freezing December morning, a 17-year-old girl named Elena Torres stood at the gates of one of the largest estates in the entire state. She wore a thin jacket that did nothing against the cold. Her shoes were old and worn. In her right hand, she carried a violin case that looked like it had seen better days. The security guard inside the small booth watched her through the glass. He had worked at this estate for over 15 years, and he had seen all kinds of people try to get inside. Reporters, salespeople, people claiming to be long-lost relatives. But he had never seen anyone quite like this girl. She looked half-frozen, her lips slightly blue, her dark hair covered in snowflakes. Yet she stood there with a strange kind of determination in her eyes. He stepped out of the booth and walked toward the gate. "Can I help you, miss?" Elena looked up at him. "I need to see Mr. Kensington." The guard almost laughed. Richard Kensington was one of the wealthiest men on the entire East Coast. He had built a massive empire in pharmaceutical distribution over the past 40 years. He owned hospitals, research facilities, and enough real estate to make your head spin. People didn't just walk up to his gate and ask to see him. That wasn't how the world worked. "Mr. Kensington doesn't see visitors," the guard said, not unkindly. "Especially not unannounced ones." "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Elena admitted. "But I only need 5 minutes. Please, it's important." "I'm sorry, miss. I can't let you in without an appointment. You'll have to contact his office and go through the proper channels." Elena nodded slowly, like she had expected this answer. But she didn't leave. Instead, she walked over to the stone wall that ran along the edge of the property and sat down on it. The guard watched her, confused. "Miss, you can't stay here. You'll freeze." "I'll wait," she said simply. The guard shook his head and went back to his booth. He figured she would give up in 10 or 15 minutes once the cold really got to her. But 10 minutes passed, then 20, then an hour. And Elena didn't move. Then she did something unexpected. She opened her violin case, pulled out an old violin, and began to play. The sound that came from that instrument was unlike anything the guard had ever heard. It was beautiful and sad at the same time, like the music itself was crying. The melody drifted through the iron gates, across the snow-covered grounds, and toward the massive stone mansion in the distance. Inside that mansion, Richard Kensington sat in his study, going over financial reports. He was 62 years old, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that had intimidated business rivals for decades. Since his wife, Margaret, had passed away 5 years ago, Richard had become something of a ghost himself. He rarely left the estate. He had no children, no close friends, no one who really knew him. He preferred it that way. People were complicated. Numbers were simple. But then he heard something that made him stop. Music. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. A violin dot. He stood up and walked to the window. From there, he could barely make out the front gate, but he could see a small figure sitting on the wall. And he could hear the melody floating through the cold air. Richard frowned. He pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Thomas, what's going on at the front gate?" The security guard's voice crackled through. "Sorry to disturb you, sir. There's a young girl here. She's been sitting outside for about 2 hours now. She asked to see you, but I told her she needed an appointment. She won't leave. Now she's playing violin. 2 hours? In this weather?" "Yes, sir. I've asked her to leave several times, but she just keeps sitting there, playing." Richard was quiet for a long moment. The music continued, haunting and persistent. Something about it tugged at a part of him he thought he had buried a long time ago. Margaret used to love music. She used to say that a person's soul revealed itself through the songs they played. "Bring her inside," Richard said finally. "Sir?" "You heard me. Bring her inside before she freezes to death." 5 minutes later, Elena Torres stood in the marble foyer of the Kensington mansion. She was shivering badly now, her whole body trembling from the cold. A housekeeper had wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, but she still clutched her violin case like it was the most precious thing in the world. Richard walked down the grand staircase and studied her. She was small and thin, with dark eyes that seemed too old for her young face. Her clothes were cheap but clean. Everything about her suggested poverty, yet she held herself with a quiet dignity that surprised him. "You wanted to see me," Richard said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, sir. Thank you for letting me in. My guard tells me you've been sitting outside for over 2 hours. In December, without a proper coat." He paused. "Either you're very determined or very foolish." "Maybe both," Elena said, and for a moment the ghost of a smile crossed her face. Richard almost smiled back. "Almost. What do you want? Money? A job? Whatever it is, you could have written a letter like everyone else." Elena shook her head. "I don't want money, Mr. Kensington. I want to play one song for my mother." Richard blinked. Of all the things he had expected her to say, that wasn't one of them. "I don't understand. What does your mother have to do with me?" "She's dying," Elena said quietly. "Cancer. The doctors say she has maybe a month left, probably less. Her whole life she talked about this house. She worked here a long time ago. Back in 2007, she was a maid. She always said this place changed her life, that something happened here that made her believe in kindness again. Her last wish is to hear me play in this house, where everything started for her." Richard searched his memory. 2007 was a long time ago. He had employed dozens of staff members over the years. He couldn't remember all their faces, all their names. "What was your mother's name?" "Isabella." "Isabella Torres." Richard shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry. I don't remember anyone by that name." Elena's face fell, but only for a second. Then that quiet determination returned. "It doesn't matter if you remember her. She remembers you. She remembers this house. And she remembers your wife." At the mention of Margaret, Richard's expression changed. His jaw tightened. His eyes grew cold. "My wife passed away 5 years ago," he said stiffly. "I don't see what she has to do with any of this." "I don't know either," Elena admitted. "My mother doesn't talk about it much. She just says that Mrs. Kensington was the kindest person she ever met, and that she owes her everything." Richard was silent for a long time. The girl stood there, still shivering slightly, still holding her violin case, still looking at him with those dark, knowing eyes. There was something about her that unsettled him, though he couldn't say exactly what. Finally, he spoke. "You came all this way, sat in the freezing cold for 2 hours, just to play one song?" "Yes, sir. And if I say no?" "If I have my guard escort you off my property right now?" Elena considered this. "Then I'll come back tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. I'll keep coming back until you say yes, or until my mother is gone, and it doesn't matter anymore." Richard stared at her. In 40 years of business, he had negotiated with the toughest, most ruthless people in the corporate world. He had never backed down from anyone. But something in this girl's voice, this teenager with her old violin and her thin jacket and her dying mother, made him hesitate. "Play," he said at last. "Let's hear what was worth freezing for." Elena opened her violin case, lifted the instrument to her shoulder, and began to play. The song was Ave Maria, and as the notes filled the grand marble foyer, Richard Kensington felt something crack open inside his chest. Something he thought had died with his wife. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change forever. The music filled every corner of the mansion. It traveled up the grand staircase, through the hallways, into rooms that had been silent for years. Elena played with her eyes closed, her body swaying gently with each note, completely lost in the melody. She wasn't performing for Richard Kensington anymore. She was playing for her mother, for every sacrifice Isabella had made, for every double shift she had worked, for every dream she had put aside so her daughter could have a better life. Richard stood frozen in place. He hadn't moved since the first note. His hands, which were always steady during business meetings and negotiations, were trembling slightly at his sides. He didn't understand what was happening to him. He had heard Ave Maria hundreds of times before. It was just a song. But somehow, coming from this girl's violin, it felt like something more. It felt like a door opening to a room he had locked away a long time ago. Memories of Margaret flooded his mind. Her laugh, her smile, the way she used to hum while making breakfast, the way she would look at him sometimes, like she was seeing someone he didn't know existed. He had buried all of that when she died. He had told himself it was easier not to feel anything at all. But now, standing in his own foyer, listening to a stranger play violin, all those feelings came rushing back like a wave he couldn't stop. When the last note faded into silence, Elena lowered her violin and opened her eyes. She looked at Richard and saw something she hadn't expected. There were tears on his cheeks. He wiped them away quickly, almost angrily, like he was embarrassed to be caught showing emotion. "That was beautiful," he said, his voice rough. "Your mother must be very proud." "She is," Elena said softly. "She's the one who taught me to play. Even when we had nothing, she always made sure I had music lessons. She used to say that music was the one thing nobody could ever take away from me." Richard nodded slowly. He walked over to a nearby chair and sat down heavily, suddenly feeling all of his 62 years. "Your mother worked here, you said?" "In 2007. Yes, sir. She was a maid. She worked here for almost 2 years, and she knew my wife." "Yes, she said Mrs. Kensington was very kind to her. That's all she ever told me. But I could tell there was more. Whenever she talked about this house, about your wife, she got this look in her eyes, like she was remembering something important, something she couldn't put into words." Richard rubbed his forehead. His mind was racing, trying to remember anything about a maid named Isabella from 16 years ago. But he came up empty. Back then, he had been consumed by work. He had barely noticed the staff. They were just people who cleaned and cooked and maintained the estate. He had never bothered to learn their names or their stories. But Margaret had. Margaret had always been different. She noticed everyone. She remembered birthdays, asked about families, treated every person who worked in their home with genuine warmth and respect. It was one of the things he had loved most about her, even if he had never told her so. "I wish I could help you," Richard said finally. "But I truly don't remember your mother. I'm sorry." Elena reached into the pocket of her thin jacket and pulled out something. It was a photograph, old and worn, the edges soft from years of handling. She walked over to Richard and held it out to him. "Maybe this will help," she said. Richard took the photograph and looked at it. His heart stopped. The picture showed a young woman in a maid's uniform, standing in this very room. She was smiling, holding a newborn baby in her arms. The baby was wrapped in a soft pink blanket, tiny and perfect. But that wasn't what made Richard's breath catch in his throat. It was the woman standing next to the maid. It was Margaret. She looked younger in the photo, her hair darker, her face unlined by the illness that would eventually take her. She was smiling too, one hand resting gently on the maid's shoulder. They stood close together, not like employer and employee, but like friends, like sisters almost. There was a warmth between them that was impossible to miss. "Where did you get this?" Richard whispered. "My mother kept it by her bed my whole life," Elena said. "That's me, the baby in her arms. My mother said it was taken the day she brought me to work because she couldn't afford childcare. She was terrified she would lose her job." But Mrs. Kensington wasn't angry. "She held me for hours," my mother said. "She sang to me and rocked me and told my mother that she was doing an amazing job." Richard couldn't speak. He kept staring at the photograph, at his wife's face, at the happiness in her eyes. He had thousands of pictures of Margaret, but he had never seen her look quite like this. So open, so full of joy. And then he noticed something else. Behind the two women, hanging on the wall, was a painting. It was a portrait of Margaret herself, one that Richard had commissioned for their 10th anniversary. It still hung in that exact spot today. But there was something wrong. In the photograph, the portrait looked different, brighter somehow, like it had been recently cleaned or restored. And there was something written at the bottom of the frame, words that Richard couldn't quite make out in the small picture. He looked up at the wall where the portrait hung now. The words were gone. The frame was different. Someone had changed it. "I don't understand," Richard muttered, more to himself than to Elena. "Margaret never mentioned any of this. She never talked about your mother. In all our years together, she never once said the name Isabella." Elena tilted her head. Maybe she had her reasons. Richard looked at the girl sharply. "What do you mean?" "I don't know, Mr. Kensington. I only know what my mother told me. But I always had the feeling that there was something more to the story. Something my mother was protecting. Or maybe something she was protecting me from." Richard stood up abruptly. His mind was spinning with questions. Why had Margaret kept this friendship secret? What had happened between her and Isabella? And why did this girl, this stranger with her sad eyes and beautiful music, make him feel like his whole world was about to be turned upside down? "Wait here," he said. He walked out of the foyer and headed toward the back of the house, to the room he had avoided for 5 years. Margaret's study. After she died, he had locked the door and never opened it again. He couldn't bear to see her things, to smell her perfume still lingering in the air, to be reminded of everything he had lost. But now he needed answers. He took the key from his pocket, the one he had carried with him every day since her funeral, and unlocked the door. The room was exactly as she had left it. Dust covered everything, but the memories were still fresh. Her books, her desk, her reading chair by the window, the small music box he had given her on their first anniversary. Richard walked to her desk and started opening drawers. Old letters, bills, receipts, nothing useful. Then he found a drawer that was locked. He didn't have a key for this one. He never even knew it existed. Without thinking, he grabbed a letter opener and forced the lock. Inside, there was a stack of envelopes tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Each envelope had the same name written on it in Margaret's elegant handwriting. Isabella. Richard single quotes. His hands were shaking as he untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. It was dated 2007, the same year Elena said her mother had worked here. He began to read, and with each word, his heart broke a little more. Margaret had kept secrets from him, important ones. And now, standing in her dusty study, with a stack of hidden letters in his hands, Richard Kensington realized that he had never really known his wife at all. Back in the foyer, Elena waited quietly. She didn't know what Richard was looking for, or what he would find. But she had a feeling, deep in her bones, that the answers her mother had kept hidden for so many years were finally about to come out. She just hoped they were all ready for the truth. Richard sat down at Margaret's desk, the stack of letters spread out before him. His hands were still shaking. The dust in the room made his eyes water, or at least that's what he told himself. He picked up the first letter and began to read. The letter was dated March 2007. Margaret's handwriting was as beautiful as he remembered. Each word carefully formed, full of grace. "Dear Isabella," the letter began. "I hope this finds you well. I've been thinking about our conversation last week, and I want you to know that I meant every word. You are stronger than you realize. What he did to you was not your fault. It was never your fault. Please remember that when the nights get hard and the doubts creep in, you deserve so much better than the life you've been given. And I promise you, one day things will change." Richard's throat tightened. He didn't understand. What had happened to Isabella? Who was the he Margaret was talking about? He picked up another letter, this one dated a few months later. "Isabella, I've made arrangements. The apartment is ready, and the first 3 months of rent have been paid. I know you're scared. I know you think you can't do this on your own. But you can. You have Elena to think about now. That beautiful little girl deserves a mother who is safe and free. Please let me help you. Please let me give you both a fresh start." Richard put the letter down. His mind was racing. Margaret had helped Isabella escape from something, someone, an abusive situation, from the sound of it. She had paid for an apartment, given this woman a chance at a new life, and she had never said a word to him about any of it. He kept reading. Letter after letter, year after year. The story slowly came together like pieces of a puzzle he never knew existed. Isabella had come to work at the Kensington estate in early 2007. She was 23 years old, newly arrived from Mexico, struggling to make ends meet. She had a husband back then, a man named Roberto, who had seemed charming at first, but turned cruel once they were married. He controlled everything. The money, her movements, her friendships. When Isabella got pregnant with Elena, things got worse. Roberto didn't want a child. He wanted Isabella all to himself. Margaret had noticed the bruises first. Small ones that Isabella tried to hide with long sleeves and makeup. But Margaret saw through the lies. She always did. Instead of looking away like so many others had, Margaret had sat Isabella down one day and simply said, "Tell me everything." And Isabella had. For the first time in years, she had told someone the truth about her life, about the fear she lived with every day, about the man who was supposed to love her but only knew how to hurt her, about her terror that he would hurt Elena too. Margaret had listened. She hadn't judged. She hadn't offered empty words of sympathy. Instead, she had made a plan. Over the next several months, Margaret secretly helped Isabella save money. She gave her extra work, paid her double what the other maids earned, and hid the extra cash in places Roberto would never find. When Isabella had enough, Margaret helped her find an apartment on the other side of the state. She paid a lawyer to help with the divorce. She connected Isabella with a support group for women who had survived similar situations. And when the day finally came for Isabella to leave, Margaret had driven her to the bus station herself. She had held Elena in her arms one last time, kissed the baby's forehead, and whispered something that Isabella would never forget. "You're going to be okay, both of you. And if you ever need anything at all, you come back to me. I will always be here." Richard wiped his eyes. He wasn't crying. He was just tired. That's what he told himself as he picked up the next letter. The correspondence continued for years. Margaret wrote to Isabella regularly, checking in on her progress, celebrating her victories, offering comfort during hard times. When Isabella enrolled in nursing school, Margaret paid the tuition. When Elena showed talent for the violin, Margaret sent money for lessons. When Isabella's car broke down and she couldn't afford repairs, Margaret bought her a new one. All of this happened without Richard knowing a single thing about it. He found a letter from 2015, and something in his chest went cold. Dear Isabella, I have to tell you something. I've been keeping it from Richard, and I think I'll keep it from him a little longer, but you deserve to know. The doctors found something. They say it's cancer. They say I might have a year, maybe 2 if I'm lucky. I'm not afraid of dying. I've lived a good life, better than I deserved. But I am afraid of leaving Richard alone. He doesn't know how to be alone. He's spent his whole life building walls around his heart, and I'm the only one who ever got through. When I'm gone, I'm afraid he'll disappear behind those walls forever. Richard had to stop reading. The words blurred before his eyes. Margaret had known she was dying. For 2 years before her death, she had carried that burden alone. She had smiled at him over breakfast. She had kissed him goodnight. She had never let on that anything was wrong. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she suffered in silence? He found the answer in her final letter to Isabella, dated just 3 weeks before Margaret passed away. I didn't tell Richard because I didn't want to see the fear in his eyes. I didn't want our last months together to be about hospitals and treatments and counting down the days. I wanted to live, truly live, for as long as I could. And I did. These past 2 years have been the happiest of my life, even knowing what was coming. Maybe especially because I knew. Richard's tears fell onto the paper, smudging the ink. He didn't bother wiping them away anymore. The letter continued. Isabella, I need to ask you something. If Elena ever needs help, if she ever finds herself lost or struggling, I want you to send her to Richard. Not for money, though he has plenty of that. I want you to send her because she has a gift. The same gift I had once, before I gave it up to become a Kensington wife. She plays violin the way I used to, with her whole heart, like music is the only language that matters. Richard remembered now. When they first met, Margaret had been a music student at Yale. She had played violin in the university orchestra. He had fallen in love with her the moment he heard her play at a campus concert. But after they married, she had slowly stopped playing. He never asked why. He assumed she had simply lost interest. Now he realized the truth. She had given it up for him, for their life together, for a world that didn't have room for a billionaire's wife who wanted to spend her days making music. The final paragraph of the letter broke him completely. Richard doesn't know it, but music is the only thing that truly reaches him. It's how I made him fall in love with me all those years ago. It's the key to unlocking the man he hides from the world. If Elena plays for him, really plays, he'll feel it. He won't be able to help himself. And maybe, just maybe, she'll remind him that there's more to life than money and power and building empires. Maybe she'll help him find his way back to the person he used to be. The person I fell in love with. The person I know is still in there somewhere, waiting. Richard sat in the dusty study for a long time after he finished reading. The snow was still falling outside the window. The house was silent. Somewhere in the foyer, a 17-year-old girl was waiting for him, not knowing that she had been sent here on purpose, not knowing that a woman she barely remembered had planned this moment years ago, hoping it would save a man she loved from himself. Margaret had known. Even in death, she was still taking care of him, still trying to break through his walls, still believing in the man he could be. Richard gathered the letters carefully, tied them back with the blue ribbon, and walked out of the study. He had spent 5 years hiding from his grief. 5 years pretending he didn't feel anything. 5 years building his walls higher and higher. It was time to tear them down. Richard walked back to the foyer slowly, each step heavier than the last. The letters were still in his hands. the blue ribbon wrapped tightly around them. His whole body felt different, like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. But something else had changed too. The numbness that had lived inside his chest for 5 years was starting to crack. He could feel things again. It hurt, but it also felt strangely like waking up after a very long sleep. Helena was sitting on a small bench near the door, her violin case resting on her lap. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. Her eyes went straight to the letters in his hands, and her face changed. She knew those letters. She had seen them in her mother's drawer 100 times. She had asked about them once, years ago, and her mother had simply said, "They're from an angel." Now Elena understood what that meant. "You found them," she said quietly. Richard nodded. He walked over and sat down on the bench next to her, something he never would have done before today. Richard Kensington did not sit on small benches next to strangers. He sat behind desks, in boardrooms, in the back of expensive cars. But today, none of that mattered. "Your mother," he said slowly. "She went through a lot." Elena nodded. "She doesn't talk about it much. The early years, I mean. But I know enough. I know that someone hurt her badly before I was born. And I know that someone else saved her. My wife saved her." "Yes." Elena looked down at her violin case. "And now my mother is dying, and she wanted me to come here. She said I had to play for you. She said it was important, but she wouldn't tell me why. I thought maybe she just wanted to thank you, or to say goodbye to this house one more time through me. But it was more than that, wasn't it?" Richard was quiet for a long moment. How could he explain what he had just learned? How could he tell this girl that his wife had orchestrated this entire meeting from beyond the grave? That Margaret had seen something in Elena, some gift, some spark, and had believed that she could reach him when nothing else could. "Your mother and my wife had a special bond," Richard finally said. "Margaret helped her escape a bad situation. She paid for her apartment, her education, her divorce. She did all of this in secret, without telling me. I never knew any of it until today." Elena's eyes widened. "She paid for my mother's nursing school?" "Yes, and your violin lessons." Elena's hand went to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes. "My mother always said that money came from a scholarship, from a foundation for immigrant women. She never told me it was Mrs. Kensington. Maybe she wanted to protect you from feeling like you owed anyone anything. Or maybe she wanted you to believe in yourself, not in someone else's charity." Elena nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "That sounds like my mother." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the snow had finally stopped falling. Weak winter sunlight broke through the clouds and streamed through the tall windows, making patterns on the marble floor. "I want to meet her," Richard said suddenly. Elena looked at him. "My mother?" "Yes. I want to meet the woman my wife loved so much. The woman she kept secret from me for all those years." Elena hesitated. "She's very sick, Mr. Kensington. She's in the hospital. Most days she doesn't have much energy. The doctors say it could be any time now." "Then we shouldn't waste another minute." An hour later, Richard's driver pulled up to St. Francis Hospital on the other side of the state. It was a modest building, nothing like the private medical centers Richard usually visited. The walls were old, the paint was peeling in places, and the hallways smelled like disinfectant and sadness. But the nurses were kind, and they smiled at Elena like they knew her well. "Your mother's awake," one of them said. "She's been asking about you all morning." Elena led Richard down a long corridor to a room at the end. She paused outside the door, her hand on the handle. "She doesn't know you're coming," Elena said. "I didn't have time to tell her. This might be a shock." "I understand." Elena pushed open the door. The room was small and simple. There was a single bed by the window, a chair for visitors, and a small table covered with flowers and cards. In the bed lay a woman who looked much older than her 52 years. Her hair was thin and gray, her skin pale and paper-like. Tubes ran from her arms to machines that beeped softly in the corner. But when she saw Elena, her face lit up with a smile that transformed her completely. For a moment, Richard could see the young woman from the photograph, the one who had stood in his foyer 16 years ago, holding her baby daughter, terrified and hopeful, all at once. "Elena," Isabella whispered. "You came back." "Of course I did, Mama." Elena went to her mother's side and took her hand. "And I brought someone with me." Isabella's eyes moved past her daughter and landed on Richard. For a long moment, she just stared at him. Then recognition dawned on her face, and her eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Kensington," she breathed. "You came." Richard walked forward slowly. He felt out of place in this small room, in his expensive coat and polished shoes. But he made himself keep walking until he was standing beside the bed. "Margaret said you would," Isabella continued, her voice weak but full of wonder. "She wrote me a letter before she died. She said that one day Elena would play for you, and you would come find me. I didn't believe her. I thought it was just a dying woman's dream. But she was right. She was always right about everything." Richard's throat was so tight he could barely speak. "She never told me about you, about any of it. I didn't know until today." Isabella nodded slowly. "She wanted to protect you. She knew you would have tried to help, to fix everything, to take control the way you always did. But some things can't be fixed by money and power. Some things just need time and patience and love. Margaret understood that. She let me heal on my own terms, at my own pace. She never made me feel like a charity case. She made me feel like a friend." Richard pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down. He didn't care about appearances anymore. He didn't care about the walls he had built or the reputation he had protected for so many years. "Tell me about her," he said quietly. "Tell me about the Margaret you knew." And Isabella did. For the next 2 hours, she talked about Margaret in a way no one ever had before. She talked about their long conversations in the kitchen while Isabella cleaned and Margaret pretended to supervise. She talked about the books Margaret would lend her, the advice she would give, the way she could make anyone feel important just by listening to them. She talked about the day Margaret drove her to the bus station, how Margaret had cried even though she tried to hide it, how she had pressed an envelope into Isabella's hands and told her not to open it until she was settled in her new apartment. Inside was enough money to live on for 6 months, and a note that said simply, "You are braver than you know. Now go prove it." Richard listened to every word. He laughed at stories he had never heard. He cried at memories he had never been part of. And slowly, piece by piece, he began to know his wife in a way he never had while she was alive. When Isabella grew tired and her eyes started to close, Elena gently suggested they let her rest. But before Richard could stand up, Isabella reached out and grabbed his hand with surprising strength. "She loved you," Isabella whispered, "more than anything in this world. She just didn't know how to show you all of herself. She was afraid you wouldn't understand. But she loved you, Mr. Kensington. Never doubt that." Richard squeezed her hand gently. "I know," he said, "and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure her love meant something." He looked at Elena, standing by the window with tears streaming down her face. "Both of you," he added. "I'm going to make sure you both know what Margaret's love meant." It was a promise. And Richard Kensington had never broken a promise in his life. The next 2 weeks moved faster than Richard thought possible. He spent every day at the hospital, sitting beside Isabella's bed, listening to her stories, holding her hand when the pain became too much. Elena was always there too, sometimes playing soft melodies on her violin to help her mother sleep, sometimes just sitting quietly by the window. Watching the snow fall outside, Richard learned more about life in those 2 weeks than he had in the past 5 years. He learned that happiness didn't come from money or success or power. It came from moments like these. Quiet moments. Human moments. Moments where nothing mattered except being present with the people who needed you. One evening, about 10 days after their first meeting, Isabella called Richard to her bedside. Her voice was weaker now, barely a whisper, but her eyes were still bright with that same warmth he had come to recognize. "I have one last wish," she said. Richard leaned closer. "Anything." Elena was accepted to Juilliard 2 years ago, the best music school in the country. But we couldn't afford it, so she gave up her spot. She never complained, never blamed me. She just got a job at a grocery store and kept practicing in our tiny apartment, pretending it didn't matter. Isabella paused to catch her breath. But it did matter. It matters more than anything. She has a gift, Mr. Kensington, the same gift your wife had, and I don't want her to give it up the way Margaret did. Richard nodded slowly. "I'll take care of it. I promise." Isabella smiled, and for a moment she looked almost young again. "I know you will. Margaret knew it too. That's why she sent Elena to you." But that wasn't all Isabella wanted. Her final wish wasn't about money or education. It was much simpler than that. "I want to hear her play one more time," Isabella said. "Not in this hospital room. Not surrounded by machines and medicine. I want to hear her play in a real concert hall, the way Margaret used to play before she gave it all up. I want to close my eyes and imagine that I'm sitting in the audience, watching my daughter shine the way she was always meant to shine." Richard was quiet for a long time. Then he stood up, pulled out his phone, and made a call. 3 days later, a private ambulance pulled up outside Carnegie Hall in New York City. It was early evening, and the streets were busy with people rushing home from work. But nobody paid attention to the ambulance or the frail woman being carefully wheeled out of it. Nobody knew that inside this famous building, something extraordinary was about to happen. Richard had rented the entire hall for one night. It cost him more money than most people earned in a lifetime, but he didn't care. He had arranged for a team of doctors and nurses to accompany Isabella. He had set up a special bed in the front row, surrounded by blankets and pillows, so she could lie comfortably and watch her daughter perform. The great hall was empty except for the 3 of them. 2,000 red velvet seats stretched out in the darkness, silent and waiting. The stage was lit with a single spotlight, and in the center of that light stood a beautiful grand piano, and a single chair for the violinist. Elena appeared from the wings wearing a gown that Richard had found in Margaret's closet. It was deep blue velvet, elegant and timeless, the same dress Margaret had worn to her last public performance 40 years ago. When Elena stepped into the spotlight, she looked like a vision from another time. Like the past and the future had come together in one moment. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. Tears streamed down her hollow cheeks. "She's beautiful," she whispered. "She's so beautiful." Richard sat beside her, holding her hand. He didn't trust himself to speak. Elena raised her violin to her shoulder. She looked out at the vast empty hall, at her mother lying in the front row, at the man who had been a stranger just 2 weeks ago, but now felt like family. She took a deep breath and began to play. The music filled Carnegie Hall like nothing had ever filled it before. It echoed off the walls, rose up to the painted ceiling, wrapped around every seat and every shadow. Elena played Brahms first, then Tchaikovsky, then a haunting piece by Bach that made Richard think of churches and funerals and the fragile line between life and death. But the final piece was different. It was nothing Richard had ever heard before. The melody was gentle and hopeful, like sunlight breaking through clouds, like flowers pushing up through snow. It was sad and beautiful at the same time, the kind of music that made you want to cry and smile all at once. When Elena finished, she lowered her violin and spoke into the silence. "That last piece was written by Margaret Kensington," she said, her voice echoing through the empty hall. "She composed it 40 years ago when she was a student at Yale. She never performed it publicly. She never even told anyone about it except my mother. She mailed it to her a few months before she died, with a note that said it should be given to me when I was ready." Elena paused, her eyes glistening with tears. "The piece is called The Gift We Leave Behind." Margaret wrote in her note that it was about the things we give to others that outlast us. The love, the kindness, the moments of grace that ripple out into the world long after we're gone. She looked directly at her mother. "This is for you, Mama, for everything you gave me, for everything you sacrificed, for teaching me that music isn't just about notes and rhythms. It's about heart. And yours is the biggest heart I've ever known." Isabella closed her eyes. A peaceful smile spread across her face. She looked like she was floating somewhere far away, somewhere the pain couldn't reach her anymore. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, my beautiful girl." 3 days later, Isabella Torres passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was holding her daughter's hand, and the last thing she saw was Elena's face, smiling down at her with all the love in the world. Richard paid for the funeral. He made sure Isabella was buried in a beautiful cemetery, overlooking the ocean, in a spot where the sun would warm her grave every morning. He stood beside Elena at the service, and when she cried, he let her lean against him like a father would Dot in the months that followed. Richard kept every promise he had made. He paid for Elena's full education at Juilliard. He hired the best teachers, bought her the finest instruments, made sure she had everything she needed to succeed. But he did something more important than that, Dot. He created the Margaret Kensington Foundation, a charity dedicated to helping young musicians from poor backgrounds. Every year, the foundation would pay for dozens of students to attend music schools, buy instruments, take lessons, follow their dreams. Every year, more young people would get the chance that Margaret never had. 4 years later, Elena Torres graduated from Juilliard at the top of her class. Her debut professional concert was held at Carnegie Hall, the same stage where she had played for her dying mother. This time, every seat was filled. Critics came from around the world. The concert was broadcast live to millions of people. Richard sat in the front row, in the same spot where Isabella had lain 4 years before. He was 70 years old now, his hair completely white, his face lined with age. But his eyes were bright and alive in a way they hadn't been for decades. When Elena took the stage, she dedicated the concert to 2 women. Her mother, Isabella Torres, who had taught her that love was the most powerful force in the universe, and Margaret Kensington, who had shown her that kindness never dies. It just finds new ways to bloom. As the music filled the hall, Richard finally understood what his wife had been trying to tell him all along. Wealth meant nothing if you didn't use it to lift others up. Success meant nothing if you didn't share it with the people around you. And the greatest gift anyone could leave behind wasn't money or power or fame. It was love. It was always love. And sometimes that love came to you in the most unexpected ways. Like a 17-year-old girl with an old violin, standing at your gate in the freezing cold, asking for nothing more than a chance to play one song.